to do everyone can hear me okay? We're good? Okay. Well, thanks for coming. It's an honor to talk to colleagues about something that's both personal and professional. So I appreciate the interest, and definitely a shout out to Lori. Thanks for helping make this happen. And Julie Carney for initiating, if not insisting, that I do this. I appreciate your encouragement and support. My goal here is definitely modest, keep it very top level. I want to actually talk less about myself and more about the process. But it's neat because it's an opportunity, which I relish, to talk about the ways my professional life really intersects with my personal life, and in complete candor, the ways in which being an analyst at CEA has literally helped inform decisions I made. And I think I can speak to the ways we see in our department data and trends and disruptions in the industry actually playing out in real time. So my story is it's certainly a personal story, but it's kind of the story of how I'm taking advantage of a lot of the things we talk about, the idea of innovation and the idea of how the industry is never static. I think all of us know that, but this story and what I've experienced, it's been both educational and a little bit humbling to see how you can take advantage of technology and really be innovative and do things that you couldn't do 5 or 10 years ago. For those of you that don't know, because I think a lot of people kind of don't know, I mean, certainly market research as a department, we're looking at data and churning out data all the time. I think one of the strengths when I speak outside the organization about what we do and how our data, whether it's consumer or the monthly tracking that we do or forecasting, we tend to have a holistic view of the industry, which I think gives us a strength that we can speak to not only what's happening right now, but it almost necessarily has us looking at past trends. And we've got the 80-year history of data that we've been accumulating over the years with the data program. And then we do our forecasting initiatives. But what that kind of impels us to do is really look at where we are now, but make predictions about, well, what's going to happen down the road. And by having an association with all these members, we're getting direct input from a lot of these manufacturers. So I think we're really well informed in order to say that this is what's going on now, and we can all see that. But what's going to happen in the future? And one of the predictions we made a few years ago was this last decade we kind of refer to in a lot of senses as the digital decade, which is when analog, whether it was on screens, what you're listening to, went from old school analog to digital. And we saw the ascension of digital displays, and TVs owned the last decade. And the sales certainly reflected that, and also the culture reflected that. And we made a prediction, I made a prediction as an analyst, that I thought there was going to be a resurgence in audio, if for no other reason, because it had been so dominated by all things display, people were necessarily going to turn back and say, well, now we have all this amazing video quality, but it doesn't sound so great. And coincidentally or not, that was when Beats came out, and suddenly the headphone market, which I think all of us can remember, were largely things you handed out for free on a plane. Suddenly you're getting headphones that cost hundreds of dollars, and I'm not saying that I or any of us predicted that, but we did have a sense that receivers, that there would be maybe a return to vinyl, a kind of a necessary and very welcome idea to get a more complete experience in the home. And how that pertains to me personally is in addition to following these trends professionally, I've been writing and doing reviews, and I was a grad student, I was an English literature major, so I've seen, my pedigree goes back to, and some of you might laugh at this, typewriters, and remembering writing papers on a typewriter, so that couldn't have been more analog. And in the space of about 10 years, the internet came along, and now that whole experience, even for me, has changed from, I'm still old school that I put my notes on a legal pad, but it comes into a computer and, of course, lives there. But I welcomed, as someone that writes about music, writes reviews about music, and has really been invested in the music industry as an industry, seeing the ways that the digital decade really revolutionized the landscape for both artists and audiences. The old days and the publishing model for both music and books was largely unchanged. I'd say the music industry for most of the 20th century, for books, goes back centuries. The means of creation, production, and distribution was virtually unchanged. But the key word was there were gatekeepers. So in the music industry, of course, to get a physical product, you had to have a company acquire your music, and that was half the battle, because then they would promote it, market it, and own it. But you physically couldn't do it unless you were, maybe with cassettes, you know, the old cliche of selling them out of the trunk of your car. But digital, of course, changed all that. And the only people that have really suffered in this process, the people that are complaining the loudest, are the old gatekeepers. The people that used to get a good chunk out of every unit sold because they own the means of distribution. So when we started seeing musicians able to create their own digital content, put it on their website and sell it, whether at a concert or sell it from their website, or go directly to Amazon, that was huge. That was the democratization of content, which hadn't existed. And as a music fan, and someone that has written novels and has written, I thought, it's too bad that won't happen in my lifetime. I'd love to see something like that happen in the book world. And I just figured there's no way, how can that possibly equate? Well, then e-readers came along, and with the massive ascension of tablets and smartphones being able to do these things, all of a sudden the proposition changed completely, and it really has mirrored what happened in the music industry, which is to say, you can have a digital file, and if people have the means of reading it, which of course is your phone or your smart pad or your tablet, whatever you have, it takes the gatekeeper out again. So in a sense, I would definitely not have predicted this. I don't know if anyone would have, but in amazingly short order, because when Napster was maybe 2000, that shook out pretty quickly, and then iTunes really helped kind of compartmentalize what was the wild, wild west of Napster, and suddenly it became a more kind of unified and sellable. Suddenly you could pay 99 cents for a song or an album, and the artist benefited from that because they were represented. It wasn't just a file that was out there in the middle of nowhere. With books, even in 2000, you could have a blog and put your novel up on your page. No one was stopping you from doing that. You could even theoretically charge money for it. But no one was going to download a Word document and then print it out on their computer and read a 300-page. That just wasn't feasible. But with e-readers, that changed everything. And so for me personally, it was an unbelievable how rapid we saw consumers, and again, this is a theme we see at CEA all the time, consumers adapt to that because the world has changed and the world's adapted. Well, suddenly reading on the go, on a mobile device, is the new normal. And what that meant for writers is, I think, even more so than the music industry, because musicians at least could theoretically have concerts and sell, swag that could help subsidize their income. Writers were entirely dependent on the old process, which was, for those of you that don't know, it's very archaic, but again, it hasn't really changed. You write a manuscript, and you typically have to go through an agency, a literary agency, who serve as kind of the gatekeepers to weed out the material they don't want, and then the agents will sell it to a publishing house, and the publishing house puts out all the upfront costs, which is why you hear about people getting their advance. You've got to pay that advance back based on the sales they assume you're going to make. So for a book to become a book, it had to go through that process, and suddenly with e-ink, you didn't have to go through that process. And the big hero in this story, at least for now, is Amazon. Because Amazon realized pretty early on, we can not only outsource this and go directly with the artists and directly with our audience, and we've already got the built-in audience for it, but we could own the process ourselves. So to me, the real quantum leap was when Amazon themselves became a player in the industry and said, we'll publish via Kindle, we'll publish the books, and we'll be the agents, we'll let you be the agent and the editor, we'll give you the mechanism to get your work out there. So all of a sudden, anybody can publish a book. And I think an immediate question and downside of that, and I share this suspicion, is, well, if everyone can write a book, isn't the market going to be flooded with crap? And the answer is yeah. But how is that a problem? When I talk about the democratization of content, that to me is the essence of you can appreciate the wisdom of the crowds and the notion that with a sufficient, if the material is sufficiently worthwhile, it'll find an audience. And that's where you have things like blogs and websites, and the old gatekeepers, you kind of had to get a book review in one of the major newspapers, and that would help you promote it. Now it's become almost the exact opposite, where you build your brand, whether it's through your blog or through your Facebook profile. Basically, social media has replaced, in a lot of ways, what the old PR firms used to do, or the publishing houses would have employees that their job was to promote and book the readings, book the reviews, get the material out there. Well, now it's all incumbent on the author. So the upside of that is anyone can do it, and that's great because anyone can do it, and it's basically free. The downside, of course, is that it's all on you to do. And I'm an old enough school guy where and I'm speaking as someone that has some analytical background and kind of understands how the wheels turn. I had no interest or certainly no expertise in understanding, well, how do I reach an audience? How do I promote? What do I do once this book is available? And I think in some regards, you have to have a presence, you have to have a profile, and social media has made that very easy to do. So I think all of us, whether we're writers or whatever we do, we kind of have our own brands. Our public persona now is a brand, and what you do with that can help or hurt you, whether it's professionally or personally. So in my case, I've been writing, I've been publishing, I work for a couple of different magazines. It was interesting in that in the old days, you had to publish a lot and eventually build a brand, and then through all these works, you would build an audience. I've went about it, and I think this is a commentary on how things are today. I had a lot of material out there, but I didn't have a product. So by the time this came out, I had a small, very modest audience, but my brand was somewhat established. But again, that wouldn't have been possible without Facebook, without social media, without Twitter, without blogging. So in a sense, again, anyone can do this. It just becomes down to how professional do you want it to be? And that kind of answers the question of, if everyone can write a book, how do we regulate that? And again, I think to me the answer is, well, there isn't an internal means of regulating it. But in the bad old days, the means of regulating it meant a few people made the decision for what books were going to get read. Now, people can make the decisions themselves. And we see the stories, whether it's Oprah's book club or someone that has a prominent followed blog, if they promote it, a book has a chance where it didn't have a chance before. So, I don't know, that was a lot. My whole intention was to take questions as we went along. Maybe that's a decent point to stop. It's like any questions about the old model or specifically like what I experienced getting into that process, or any questions at all? Yeah.
Sean, when online publishing first started, I think it was Stephen King had the model of putting out one chapter at a time.
Yeah.
That fall on the wayside entirely. It seemed like that experience that people couldn't hang on chapter after chapter.
I think the idea was, I think they were really trying maybe too hard to mimic iTunes and the whole idea of serialization, which going back to the 1800s was how Dickens and all of those old guys would publish, is the magazines, in order to sell copies, would put a chapter at a time, and the writers would literally write their books a chapter at a time. I think in the early days, people like Stephen King were trying to test the waters and say, I don't want to put it all out there so it gets bastardized for free, because I do think, so when I use the example of like my website, no one would buy, or no one, very few people other than like my family would be interested in downloading my book, but people would be interested in downloading Stephen King's book. So I think that was an initial challenge. If Stephen King put it all out there and said, pay to play, my novel's on my website, I think there would be people that would cut and paste it, and then it would be free. So they're trying to navigate a way that, how do I get it out there and get interest where it's not an all or nothing proposition? And I think they would have continued to struggle with that, but e-readers made that problem go away, virtually. It certainly wasn't overnight, but that meant people could pay for it, and just like you do with a regular book, you might not read it that day, but you have it, and then you own it. And again, everyone benefits from that. The artist certainly has a bigger stake in what they own, and the audience, the prices are cheaper. Now instead of a paperback that had to be $25 because that's how they recoup their costs, that's another aspect of this that's really positive. And I think in terms of CEA looking at it professionally, it's a very green in almost every sense of the word. Everything e-ink is virtually, it's treeless. It's print on demand, which I can get into a little bit, like how that works. But back in the bad old days, it existed for years. Part of the problem with the way the industry worked is publishers, even with the best intentions, took a fraction of what authors sent them, but there was an assumption that they took what they thought would sell. And in order to justify, and again, I can defer to people in other departments who understand like production, because I don't, very rudimentary level. But in order to get the printing press to make it affordable, they had to do a small test run of say 2,000 or 3,000 copies. that was necessary in order to get the work order done, to get the book printed, and to make it economical. What would end up happening invariably is, say, 90% of those authors would only sell a couple hundred copies. At a certain point, the bookstores say, we need to clear our shelves, we're sending these back, and that's where the term pulp literally comes from. Like, pulp fiction is pulp that they would send back to the processing plants and they would recycle them or turn them into pulp, because what are you going to do with hundreds of thousands of books that are out there that didn't sell? And again, your lifespan. So if you were a writer, even if you were a well, celebrated author with great reviews, but it just didn't catch on with the public, at a certain point, those books went out of circulation. Now with with an e-reader, you put your book on Amazon, at least in theory, it's out there forever. It never needs to be serialized. It never needs to be renewed. There's not a second printing press. Successful authors have, like, this is the 10th printing of this book. That's because they've sold out of the previous printings. But now with e-readers, there's no issue with that. So it's out there forever. But again, when I say green, it's wonderful because obviously there's no trees being cut down in the service of digital books. But what I have my book working through it, so I work with Amazon and their Kindle, and it's print on demand. And I don't want to patronize people that know that, but for people that don't, I mean, it literally is print on demand. And I don't have any idea how sophisticated, but when I say Amazon went from outsourcing in the early days, they realized at a certain point very shrewdly that it's probably going to be a huge investment on our part, but if we own this, we'll own all aspects and we won't have to outsource, and we'll make a tremendous profit. So they've got the mechanisms in place. When I put my book up for Kindle, I just sent them a digital file that sits in their system, and someone goes online and buys the book. That goes into the queue. It doesn't take, once we get 10 orders, we'll fulfill that. Each book sold goes into this huge machine, I imagine, and the book goes down the assembly line along with all the other books that are being ordered at that moment. And in 2 days, you get a physical book mailed to you. So again, I can't even fathom how complicated and complex and expensive that infrastructure is, but the reality is, it was a real, when it was nascent, I imagine companies were using outsourcing, and it would probably require a lot of money, and it was probably something where the turnaround time was not quick. Since Amazon owns it, they can make it happen, and virtually it's a seamless transition from sale to book at your house in 2 days, and Amazon's made that possible. So somebody else had raised a hand. Was there another comment or question? Julie.
Actually, I think you probably have a full presentation, but I would like to know, sort of from the human interest side too, like, why the book? Why,
Yes.
what, you have this amazing life experience.
Yes.
And you decided to memorialize it.
Well, so yeah, and I appreciate that. Yeah, like I said, I certainly didn't want to talk too much about, I also didn't want to bore you with, like, technical mumbo jumbo, but I have been a writer. I mean, again, I'm was an English major, so that's my background. And I definitely have experienced the industry, and I've never had any, I don't think any artist should have any bitterness, or it's a business that wants to make money. So your book can't get published. There may be a million reasons for it, but the publishing houses want to find the next big thing. It's just, for some of the reasons I mentioned, it's very challenging. But in 2002, I lost my mother to cancer. She battled cancer for 5 years. And needless to say, that was a very profound family experience. And at the time, I figured I'd write about it at some point. And interestingly or not, I had tried, once I was ready to grapple with it several years later, I figured it would be a novel, and I would use this material as the basis for a work of fiction. And I was having a really hard time with it, for obvious reasons, but I was having a hard time kind of wrapping my mind around, well, how do I get the characters represented, and what's the narrative arc? And in the meantime, I had started blogging on my own time. And that was my first real experience with nonfiction that was presumably fit for public consumption, and writing in the first person and writing about myself, which really removes a lot of the barriers that even a fiction writer has, because you can always say, well, that's not true, or that's made up. So it occurred to me one day that it could be, and the more I thought about it, I realized it had to be a memoir. And again, in my experience, a memoir is something a famous person writes. I mean, who wants to read about some bozo that no one's heard of? How do they have the audacity to write a memoir? But what I realized is, A, that does happen all the time, and a lot of the memoirs that are written by famous people, invariably horribly written books, but they're fascinating and they sell because we want to know more about our celebrities. The idea of this book was really to tell my mom's story and tell my story, but what I really wanted to do, because we learned a lot, and I'm happy to say that even in the last decade, the way we deal with cancer and the way we handle it as a society, I think is changing for the better. My mom died of colon cancer, and if she'd ever had a colonoscopy, which Katie Couric, to name one person, I think in the last 10 years has helped make kind of everyone knows what that is now. My mom never got a colonoscopy partly because they just didn't do that 20 years ago. If she had had one, they might have detected it and she might never have had cancer. I've had 3 colonoscopies because of my family history, but it's wonderful because I've got the clean bill of health and they say, we'll see you in 5 years. But one of the things I wanted to do in the book is kind of interrogate how we deal with sickness, a sick person dying, and grief. So in some regards, it's definitely a heavy topic, and it's not light reading. But I knew pretty early on that I didn't want it to be, and I've read my share of memoirs, and in preparation to write this, I've read memoirs about cancer written by people that have been through a similar experience. And I think there's 2 things that informed like how I approach this, which one, everyone's dealt with loss on some level. Hopefully a lot of you haven't dealt directly with like a immediate family member, but you know, it's a topic that I think everyone knows about, everyone can relate to. So you certainly don't want to patronize your audience and also make it a very narcissistic endeavor, which the memoirs I've read that I haven't been satisfied with are kind of a catalog of woes. This is what happened, and then we had to do this, and then we had to do that. And to me, those are depressing, and those are kind of self-absorbed. You certainly can feel sorry for someone and be really moved by their experience, but what is that ultimately doing? What I wanted to do, which was fairly ambitious, and I don't know if I pull it off, but what I wanted to do was somehow make it a little more universal and talk directly and really honestly about things I wish we had known, or lessons that we learned the hard way that I think every family going through this learns. And to give one example, because one of the things I really like, I had very modest aspirations in terms of what do I want to accomplish with this. And I did have the very cliched but genuine thought of, if one person reads this and understands something that I wish I'd known, that justifies the endeavor. So just to take one example, my family was very aware of hospice, what great people they are, what great work they do, and we knew they were available. And when the time came, we got hospice involved. But what I didn't know, and I think a lot of people might not know, is that hospice is available way before the quote-unquote end. And for one, somber example, but toward the end, my mom was, dehydrated a lot. She had to go. We had to take her to a treatment center, to get fluids. And what we didn't know at the time was hospice is available. They could have been doing house calls, and they could have been doing that. So we meant well. It was literal ignorance. We didn't know. So little things like that to me, it also helped deal with the grief, to not be bitter about it and say, well, man, if we'd known that, like, it was what it was. But I love when I've done readings and shared those kind of stories, and people kind of nod their head and go, well, that's good to file away, and no. So my goal writing this was certainly, you don't write a book without being somewhat self-absorbed, and the idea of, I am ultimately talking about myself and putting myself out there in ways that are, potentially embarrassing. To me, having blogged and maybe found a little bit of a balance between what's relevant and what do people want to know about, and what's kind of a more universal thing that we can discuss, as opposed to, I'm throwing it all out there and who cares? I mean, I just don't think there's a lot of literary value in that. So is that?
Yeah,
sorry.
no, that's really helpful just to get some good context.
So, and I'd definitely be happy to answer more questions, but so one of the things I did, so when the book, I made the decision based on a lot of the stuff I was talking about earlier. It made sense for me to pursue self-publication. I felt like I had enough of a platform, again, with a lowercase p, but I mean, I had somewhat of a presence that I had a chance to find an audience. And it just made sense for me to pursue it that way, but again, mostly because of the technology and how easy it is. The other side of that, of course, is I don't know the first thing about design. I don't really know that much about marketing, and I don't know that much about professional editing and typesetting. So I worked and I employed professionals as freelancers to help me do that. So, the book it's a book. I mean, it comes out and it looks, but I couldn't have done that. I mean, I could have uploaded a picture, and you can go to Amazon and see the ones that don't succeed. You know, they look unprofessional. And for me, I celebrate that, though, in all sincerity. If someone wants to publish a book for whatever reason, I love the idea that they can. And they might just be doing it for posterity and say, this is like for my dad, and I don't care if anyone else reads it. Well, that's great. And if an audience finds it, then the opportunity's there. For me, once I did all of the dirty work behind the scenes of having a professional editor, having a book designer, it was ready to go. Then the answer is, other than Facebook, what do you do to get it out there? And one of the things I hit on was I wanted to, rather than be that guy, which I think I was prone to being, of saying, if I ever become a famous writer, I'll give back and I'll give to some of these charities. I thought, why don't you put your money where your mouth is, and from the get-go, align yourself with some charities and do your readings and the self-promotion. Even standing here, I think any normal person is very wary of. It's just, you're not normal if you enjoy talking about yourself and thinking that you're thinking of yourself in the third person. So I was honestly, I was a big balancing act between wanting a book you're proud of to find an audience and doing what you need to do to promote it, but also keeping the focus on something positive. So I was fortunate I did some research and I knew some people, and I aligned myself with a handful of local charities. And my idea was, I want to do book readings, and for each reading, they'll be co-operating as a fundraiser. And my goal was to raise $10,000 the first year through a whole year of different events. A reading here, go to a vineyard, go to a this, do that. I started doing 5Ks, which is ridiculous. But I've raised $8,000 since September, and the year's not half over. So, thank you. Thank you. But the point is that, to me, that was a real, that keeps it grounded and kind of human. The idea of, well, what did I write this book for? And yeah, I mean, of course, if you write a book, you want it to find an audience, like I said, and you love the idea of, maybe a lot of people will like it and respond to it, and that's great. But the ultimate goal is to spread awareness and to have kind of a positive discussion about, again, I think as Americans, I don't think it's terribly controversial to say, for very understandable reasons, we don't want to talk about death. I don't want to talk about death. I didn't. I don't now. I don't want to think about myself maybe having cancer or any of you being sick. But I think in America, because of the way insurance works and the way the medical establishment is, it's kind of an imperfect storm of denial and lack of awareness. So again, for me, there's nothing celebratory about, let's talk about cancer. But there are positive ramifications when people share stories and talk about what they've learned. And again, I think the groundswell is behind this movement, if it can be said as such, the idea that people should be better informed and can make better decisions. And to share one instance of what I'm talking about, when I was writing the book, I had noticed, maybe because I was paying more attention, but looking at the research, I was noticing there were more and more articles written by doctors addressing the issue of how we die. And what I found was that doctors die very differently than us, which on one hand is not surprising, right? What was surprising to me was that they don't die better because they're so rich and connected and have resources, have access to the best care, all of which they do. The reality that I found, which I thought was fascinating, and I wanted to explore a little bit in the book, is that a lot of doctors have gone on record as saying, we deal with this every day, so if I see someone in stage 4, which basically is, it's very unlikely, like that's terminal and there's no hope for recovery, doctors, when they get that diagnosis, opt not to get treatment. They don't prolong it with chemo. And that's a very complicated, controversial topic, but I bring it up simply to say, I thought it was fascinating that doctors that you'd think, I know how to get this and I can walk in and I don't have to wait in line, they've seen the ways in which, I think, again, as Americans, our attitude in many good ways is we're gonna fight and we're gonna do whatever I'm gonna do to beat this. And doctors see families with a grandparent or a parent or a child, heaven forbid, with a stage 4 prognosis, and they spend their last few months getting chemo and having a horrible quality of life. To me, there was something there. There was something to that doctors not only do this, but are willing to talk about it and say, we're not in the position to counsel a family and say, if I were you, I would maybe not get treatment and enjoy, or have your last few months be as peaceful as possible. Their job is to say, here are your options, and I think